I am Julie Kwan. I am a workforce development specialist at Bay Area Academy, and I will be monitoring the chat. So if you have questions for Darryn, you can place it there and I will bring it to his attention at a good time. And in addition, I will be keeping an eye on the raised hand feature when it comes to the time for group participation. All right. We do ask if folks have the ability to turn their videos on, that you do use that feature because it is helpful for us to feel like there is actually an audience out there, and we appreciate being able to see all your wonderful faces. Although if it's not an option for you, we do understand. I am very excited to introduce Darryn Green, who will be presenting his workshop, Engaging with Youth About Sexual Orientation, Gender Identity, and Expression in a Trauma-Informed System. Darryn Green is a child welfare training consultant living in San Francisco, California. He specializes in topics related to working with transition-age youth and emerging adults impacted by systems of care. He has over 20 years experience working with organizations that empower youth to develop leadership and advocacy skills to improve the systems they're impacted by. He holds a bachelor's degree in communication studies with a minor in counseling from San Francisco State University. Darryn is a trainer and coach for the Trauma-Informed Systems 101 training with the East Bay Agency for Children's Trauma Transformed program. Darryn is a former foster youth that has been working in collaboration with youth serving professionals in the nonprofit and child welfare system for over half of his life as an advocate, educator, trainer, and mentor. He shares his experiences in care alongside 10 other LGBTQ youth in the digital story series titled Breaking the Silence from 2005. I'm very excited to bring forward Darryn Green.
Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you so much, Julie, for the intro. I'm happy to be here, and thank you all for showing up. This is the first opportunity I've got to participate in a conference like this, and I'm really excited and hope that you can gain a lot from today's workshop. So today's workshop is called Engaging with Youth About SOGIE in a Trauma-Informed System, and we're going to be covering a few things together. But first, I just wanted to remind everyone, if you haven't already got a chance to do so, to please go ahead and rename yourself in the participant box and add your preferred gender pronouns. There's an example for mine, which is he, him, his. So thank you so much for that intro. Just wanted to add a little bit more details, which I didn't really include in the bio, is that the youth engagement experience I have is primarily due to my involvement with the California Youth Connection. And so that organization is a nonprofit that empowers current and former foster youth who are between ages of 14 and 24 to improve the child welfare system that they're involved in. And so not only was I a member when I was a young person, which I started at 15, but I actually became a staff person back in 2009 after I moved to the Bay Area. And so I held a bunch of different roles, served in the training department, where I got to do a lot more one-on-one hands-on experience. And so one of the things that I learned from all of this is that it's really important to bring the youth voice into a room whenever we're doing trainings. And so there's a couple opportunities I've done so in today's training. If you want to learn more about my background or some of the resources that I pulled together, you can find that information at dinsightconsulting.com. And I'll make sure to provide the PowerPoint to the team to send out to you after the training, or after the workshop. So before we jump into everything, I do want to get a chance to get to know who's in the room. Unfortunately, because there's so many folks, we can't get a proper introduction, but we figured we could do a little poll so we can get a feel of how many folks are in different roles with our young people. And so I'm going to administer a quick little poll. You should see a prompt to participate pop up, and we'll give you a few moments to respond. The goal is to click every label that applies to you. So please check all that applies. So here we go. The poll has been launched. Looks like we have about half participants so far. Give a few more seconds for the last folks to respond. All righty. So it looks like we have a majority of folks are child welfare workers. I'm so excited that you're all here. I hope you gain a lot from today's workshop. We have a few supervisors, about 5 or so, a couple interns, and even some former foster youth here, which is great. I'm going to be bringing up a lot of content which may be familiar with for many of you all. I'm hoping that there's something new that you were able to gain to today's workshop. So I'm going to go ahead and end this poll and share the results for everyone to be able to see. You should see a screen pop up with the results. So thank you for participating. So today's workshop is going to be, we're going to be covering 3 primary objectives, primary goals. My hope is that after this workshop, you'll be able to identify 3 or more laws that actually necessitate enhanced youth engagement practices with child welfare workers and caregivers around LGBT youth in care. Another objective is I hope that through some of the activities that we do together, well, you get a chance to better align your knowledge and practice with the 6 principles of a trauma-informed system that have been created by Trauma Transform's East Bay Agency for Children's Trauma Transformed team. So we're going to be covering each of those principles in detail. And then do an activity where you get to brainstorm some solutions or best practices that you've either put into practice or hope to put into practice moving forward. And the final objective is that after this training, we hope that you're able to describe 3 or more of these best practices that will enable you to better engage with LGBT youth around, or actually all youth around sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression. So before we get started, I just wanted to make sure that everyone got a chance to download and have received all of the handouts. So if you could, in the participants box, go ahead and click a yes if you have access to those documents. And if you don't, please in the chat box add your email and send that to us so that way our staff team can make sure that you've been sent the email. Looks like we have a few responses from folks. All right, thank you all. So I'm going to review a few of the handouts that we'll be covering today. So if you can take a look at my screen. The first handout that will be provided to everyone is a full-size version of this hate-free zone poster. This was actually created by the Foster Care Ombudsman. And this can be downloaded from the website. And obviously you have a PDF version. So I strongly encourage you to duplicate this and post it wherever you have young people once we get back to some semblance of business as usual. This is a way that you can help create a more safe space. It's a way to indicate to the young people that come into your space that at least here is somewhere that they can have a support from an adult. This document you may not have received. I just realized I haven't sent. It's called the Queer and Trans Youth Rights in Foster Care. So I'll go ahead and upload a copy of this into the chat box. So you should be able to download this. We won't be using this in any activities today, but it's a great tool for you to have to start conversations with young folks around their rights. Many of you who have participated in a SOGIE training that I've done may have already been familiar with this. So the next 3 documents I'm going to pull up are fact sheets, which we're going to be using in one of our first activities together. These were created by Equality California and the National Center for Lesbian Rights. So we're going to be doing a small breakout session where each of you will get a chance to review as a group these fact sheets, and then provide a quick summary and a large group debrief. So this one's AB 959, which is the LGBT Disparities Reduction Act. This one is 1856, which is the LGBT Cultural Competency Law. And this one is a fact sheet for AB 458, which is the Non-Discrimination Act. One of our first activities we're going to do together is a lecture on the differences between sex, gender, and sexual orientation. And we're going to be reviewing some basic terminology that's tied to LGBT young people. And so this document was created by the National Center for Lesbian Rights. It's a terms list. And so these are common terms that they pulled together that you may be familiar with. And so this is just a resource for you to use to engage with folks around terminology. And we'll be covering more about that a little bit later. And the last documents that I wanted to share were all tied to trauma transforms, trauma and system, or trauma, or healing system work. So these documents are for your reference, so you can better understand how Trauma Transform does their work with improving systems of care to be more moving from a trauma reactive to a trauma informed into healing organizations. And so we're going to be reviewing some of their methodology together as we talk about the different principles. So I hope you found that useful. This principles and action document we're going to be using in our activity around the brainstorm. So if anyone has any questions, please go ahead and post them in the chat and we'll have our team respond. Alrighty. So what is SOGIE anyway? Does anyone want to go ahead and give us what your understanding of what the SOGIE acronym stands for? Can we have a volunteer from the group share?
Sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression.
Absolutely. One of the things that's important to point out about SOGIE is that everyone has a SOGIE. Everyone has a sexual orientation, a gender identity, and a way that they express it, which is often based on our cultural framework. One of the things that's really helpful for folks is to recognize that there's actually a difference between sex, gender, and sexual orientation. And so this may be a review for many of you all, but for those who may be new to these concepts, there's 2 frameworks I'll share. One of them is here, where our world tends to put things on a spectrum. So when it comes to our biological sex, we have, this is based on how our body is formed, both our physical anatomy, the chromosomes, and how our hormones are expressed as we mature. And so that many people conceptualize this on a spectrum between male and female, with biological characteristics that are either ambiguous or in some way combined. We have the intersex folks. And so when it comes to gender identity, however, this is more of people's sense of self, their actual perspective of where they fit into the world. And often their gender identity is based on their cultural frame. And so each different cultural or community might have different expectations or different ways of defining what is a male expression of gender and what is a female expression of gender. But there's many folks who either resist the whole concept of the binary between male and female gender identities, and some folks that perceive things as more of a combination. And so those folks fall into the different the different terms that fall, like gender non-binary or gender queer, where folks are actively resisting this cultural construct of what is male and female. And those who other people may label as transgender are folks that may have a combination of different characteristics along the spectrum. And so we're going to be going on a little bit more in a moment around transgender identity. But we also know that sometimes people's identity is really expressed based on, or people tend to express their identity in different ways. And so even if someone may identify as being female, for example, they might express their female gender in a more masculine way. And so expression is more about the way that you communicate yourself, your gender to the world, and also how people receive it. So how people perceive your gender is based on their own understanding of expression. And so on this binary, we have masculine and feminine. We have folks that might have a combination of qualities that are ways of expressing, which may be deemed androgynous. We also have those who are non-binary, which prefer to express their gender in a way that challenges the normative expectations around gender. And so oftentimes people lump all these people into a group called gender non-conforming because they're not conforming to the typical binary. And then finally, we have a sexual orientation. And one's orientation is really tied to who you're romantically, physically, and sexually attracted to. And that's a very personal experience. Many times one's sexual identity may be independent of their sexual orientation. And for many of those folks, they go through a period of discovery, which you might actually observe in some of your teens. You know, developmentally speaking, a lot of our adolescents and young adults are going through a period where they're really trying on different identities. And so in that time, they're also having a deeper understanding of their attractions, and they may express it in different ways. And so you might see over time a change in their identities during this time. And when it comes to sexual orientation, there's a whole different, I would say a constellation of different identities that are tied to one's sexual orientation. But the ones that fall within this binary here for the spectrum are people who may be biologically attracted to people of the same sex, would be considered homosexual, and those who are attracted to folks who are of opposite sex may be considered heterosexual. But then there's many folks who may have no physical attraction to people's gender or their bodies. And so those folks may, there may be folks who are attracted to both genders in different varying degrees, who may be considered bisexual, and those who may have no attraction to anyone's particular gender, which would be considered asexual. And so the main goal of this is to give you just a basic kind of understanding of the differences between sex, gender, and sexual orientation. One of the other ways that people have been familiar with understanding these concepts is the genderbread person. So maybe if you get a chance, go ahead and mark in the chat, in the participants, go ahead and put your little thumbs up to let us know if you're already familiar with this framework, the genderbread person. So this one actually shows that same concept that I showed earlier, but in a more colorful and different way. And this is a tool that can be very helpful with having conversations around sexual orientation and gender identity and expression with young people. And so it breaks it down similarly with the binaries. Gender identity, womanness, manness, gender expression. We have the identity here, which is tied to your brain. Your heart symbolizes attraction, the romantic and physical, and then the biological sex is shown this transgendered symbol here with all the different symbols connected.
Darryn, it looks like there's a mix of people familiar with this and those who've never seen it before.
Excellent. So transgender is actually a term that the Youth Training Project refers to as an umbrella term, because it's a label, or a category rather, that is used to describe a whole constellation of different identities and labels that either put upon people or people adopt themselves. What we've learned about identity is that there's power in being able to identify yourself and have an identity label that you can use to connect with other people who you perceive as like. And that's how communities are formed, really. And so the goal of this activity is really just to show you how some of the basic terms that are tied to this category. But it's important to note that not all folks might identify as these labels. These may be labels that have been put upon other folks. And so it's really, really important when you're engaging with anyone that you come from a cultural humility lens and really just ask questions. In my experience working closely with teens is that many young people are a lot more understanding and willing to share if they hear from you that humility. When you say something as simple as, I'm still learning, I really want to understand, more about the LGBT community. So I'm curious, like, how do you define yourself, or not define, but how do you describe yourself, and what labels or identities might you prefer to be identified as? And if you just ask that question, what does this mean to you? And that actually might open up a whole dialogue, which could help you not only expand your knowledge, but also help other folks feel heard and listened to and understood. And so these are some terms that you might have heard. I'll just explain a few. One of them that's really important is the pre-posted non-operative transsexual. So these are labels that are placed upon folks who may want to express their gender in a biological way. So they might actually want to do some kind of transition, either by doing taking medications to actually help their bodies look a little more expressive of their actual gender, or may actually go through top or bottom surgery. And so those folks might fall in the category of pre-operative, where they're going through the process of preparing themselves for the transition. Post-operative, which means that they've actually gone to the transition and done the medical interventions. And non-operative would be transsexual folks who live as their actual gender, but may not actually want to do any kind of medical intervention. And so it's really important when you're working with young people who are going through transition that you support them and help them feel, or rather help them get access to the medical resources and social supports that they may need to go through this potentially challenging time. Another term that may be new to folks is called two-spirited. This is a term that's, or a label that's used to describe many indigenous folks, or rather, there's some indigenous cultures that have a third gender, which would be considered two-spirited by many. And those folks most often aren't even marginalized like we might assume in our mainstream society. Oftentimes two-spirited folks are usually exalted by these cultures and usually hold a very special role in the community, either as caregivers or spiritual leaders. And so it's really important to understand that different cultures might orient to different gender identities differently than we might expect. And what I mean by indigenous would be like native cultures, different Native American and other communities within Native folks. So I won't go into more detail about these labels, because one of the things that we've provided to you is a list of terms in your handouts called Breaking the Silence, or sorry, called, it's Breaking the Silence. It was created by the National Center for Lesbian Rights. And in there, it has a list of different terms, including the breakdown between sex, gender, and sexual orientation that we just covered. So this document is really useful for starting conversations. So I really hope you you find it useful when you're discussing things with your young people. So the terms that I described are listed here as well. And then at the very bottom of the document, or rather the last page, has the breakdown around gender identity and sexual orientation. One of the things I did want to leave with you is a concept that actually Rob Warnoff uses often in his LGBT trainings. And there's a famous author in San Francisco by the name of Armistead Maupin. And he wrote this amazing series of stories called Tales of the City. I don't know if any of you are familiar with them. I know that they've been converted into video or movies, and they even have on Netflix a new iteration of the characters. But one of the characters is a trans woman by the name of Anna Madrigal. And she says to one of the characters there that's from a Midwest area, still learning and getting used to this, new world of so many different and diverse folks. And she says to her, you don't have to keep up, dear, you just have to keep open. And so that phrase really resonates, so much with this idea of when it comes to understanding young people and their terms that they define themselves as, or the labels and identities, is that it's not about, having a competent knowledge about the different types of labels that are out there. It's more about keeping open, being curious, and really asking, getting to know folks and how they identify. Not only is it a sign of respect, but it's an opportunity to connect and develop new relationships. So I hope that thought you can leave with each of y'all. So this next section, we're going to be talking about the importance of affirming a positive LGBT identity when it comes to those young people who are, finally coming out and identifying themselves. So I'm curious to the group, what are your thoughts around why is it important to affirm a positive identity for our young people that we work with? So can we have a couple volunteers share some of their thoughts? Please go ahead and raise your hand, and the staff will call on you.
If folks need to know where to raise their hand, click under participants, and there should be a raise hand feature on the left, the bottom left of that box. All right.
Frazier?
Hi.
Frazier?
Hi, yes.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's important because it allows them to see that you're okay with them. In working with kids and teens, when they know that you're a part of them or you understand them a little bit, it helps them to be more open and communicative, because a lot of times kids and teens, they're worried about what someone might think of them. And so when you affirm who they are and you're okay with it, they're more open to talk. Since I learned about using the pronouns, when I meet kids, especially kids who may appear to be questioning or maybe, not the normative, I guess, is that I always introduce myself as my name and my pronouns to let them know that, hey, I'm a friend. I understand what's going on, or you're the community. So it lets them know that I'm an ally. If that makes sense.
It does. And thank you so much for bringing up that example. One of the things that we encourage as a way to help folks affirm a positive identity is by modeling inclusion. And so by modeling that, the preferred gender pronouns and using that and making that a normalized practice, you're helping create an environment of inclusion. And so thank you for sharing that point.
We have two more thoughts, Darren. So Avni posted in the chat, it allows acceptance for the individual and positively impacts their mental health. And then I see that Rosie has raised her hand. So Rosie, if you would unmute yourself and lower your hand, we'd love to hear what you're thinking.
Oh, I need to find how to lower my hand. I found how to raise it.
Well, I was just going to share, it creates a sense of safety and how important that is with working with, especially with youth, but with any family in general, any client.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So this video here, some of you might have seen it. It's called Reteaching Gender and Sexuality. And so we're going to play the video and then ask a few questions about how this video may impact you. So I just want to give you a heads up, there might be some quality issues with this video, but my hope is that at least you can listen to the audio so that we can receive what the young people are lifting up. This video was created by putthisonthemap.org, and it's used to help organize and help shift people's perspective around the conversation around gender and sexual orientation.
This is about way more than bullies in our schools.
This is about our school boards, our homes, and our country.
This is about every small town, every suburb, and every city.
This is about how people talk about us and treat us.
This is about how we talk about ourselves and treat ourselves.
This is not just about how it gets better when you get older.
Do you want me to wait till later?
Hell no.
This is not just about being picked on for being different.
It's about being queer.
This is about how people assume that I'm a girl.
People ask me if I have a girlfriend.
People assume that I'm a boy.
I am so over that.
I'm so over that.
I'm pretty much over that.
Like the whole, when did you come out?
As if it were one time.
In the locker room, in the bathroom.
On the first day of school.
And the second, and the third.
To my English teacher, to my math teacher, to my science teacher.
At my last job interview.
Right now.
Right now.
Right now.
We can shift the conversation about gender and sexuality.
This is reteaching gender and sexuality.
Because we all have a gender and a sexuality. The very concept of coming out is an old, sad idea.
That normal is being straight.
And everything else is just LGBT. TQQIAA.
This is about how my identities cannot be summed up in letters.
Together, we're taking a deeper look at what's happening in our communities.
This is how queer youth like me wind up homeless.
And dropping out of school.
Getting harassed by the police. This is how queer youth like me end up in jail.
This is not just about same-sex marriage or military service.
This is about a culture of don't ask, don't tell. In my school.
This is about not having supportive adults in my life up until now.
And this is about needing more than just a safe space.
How about liberating space?
This is about being happy.
This is about having a personal connection.
I'm not interested in my community just surviving.
I want us to be thriving.
I want my life to be awesome now.
This is about young people being educators and advocates for themselves.
This is about the power of a young queer person meeting another queer person. Like me.
Or like me.
Or like us. This is about people letting go of old ideas.
I am a boy and a girl.
I can like boys and girls. And
I can be none of the above.
This is reteaching gender and sexuality.
And not only to the bullies.
Or the newspapers.
Or the president.
But to our superintendents and teachers.
People that write our health books.
And our history books.
Our social workers and doctors.
Our police departments, our churches.
To our friends, to our family, and to our legislators.
Join us to put this on the map.
So I'm curious for each of y'all, what jumps out at you about these young people and what they said? So in the chat, we have some responses that these young people are exhausted and fighting back, that they want to be valued for who they are. Absolutely. Right. Yes, and some of these young people, I mean, clearly these young people are using their voice. They recognize the power of their voice and they want to be heard. It appears that many of these young people as well were rejecting the labels, which is a way of establishing, more independence from the things, the tendency for our society to put labels onto them. Yes, and one of the things that's important to resonate too, or that to lift up for these young people, is that they're showing a shift from the way things used to be to a more empowered space. And it's a best practice that we do what we can to empower young people to make change, or at least take control of their own lives. But we know that when it comes to best practices, they sometimes get lost when you have a system that is created in a way that minimizes those opportunities. So we're going to go a bit more about that in a little while. I mainly wanted to share this video to show that although there are still many young people who are still negatively impacted in the child welfare system due to their LGBT identities, or at least the way people perceive them to have an LGBT identity. We also have young people out there that have been affirmed and have been empowered to lift up and speak out. And so you might see a whole diaspora of that experience with the young people you work with. My hope for you is that you work with these young people to move from a place of victimhood to an empowered space. And we're going to go over some of those engagement strategies that can be used to help shift those young people into that role, or at least partner with them to increase opportunities for them to grow. So the next section we're going to focus on, you're going to get an opportunity to break out into groups. So for this activity, we're going to break you into 6 smaller groups. And each of these groups will be assigned one fact sheet to review together. And the goal of this activity is for you to discuss the fact sheet, like what information shared on the fact sheet, and really identify together, like, what is the main goal or primary objective of the law? What is the problem that the law is attempting to address? And what is the solution that they're proposing? And so those 3 questions, I hope that you discuss as a group, and it may be helpful to assign someone to take notes, but that's not required. My goal is to get you familiar with the laws. And so breakout groups number 1 and 2 will focus on AB 458, and I'll make sure that this instruction is posted in the chat. Groups 3 and 4 will focus on AB 1856, and groups 5 and 6 will focus on AB 959. So if you haven't done so yet, please go ahead and go to that email that was sent to you and download those documents and maybe pull them up on your screen for this activity. All right, everyone. So I'm curious, how was that whole experience for everyone being in those breakout rooms? So if you'd like to respond, please go ahead and put a little hands up, and one of our colleagues will call on you. So what was it like being in that breakout session?
And if you need to find that raise hand feature, go under participants, it'll be on the bottom left. I see Tiffany Garcia has her hand raised, so I'll unmute you.
Yeah, so being in the group and looking at the legal, the policy made me think about the work that I do and how, I never knew the exact policy that, I'm doing the work, all the time, asking caregivers, foster caregivers about their willingness to care for youth that express themselves, have different, gender expressions, sexual orientation, gender identity, all of that. And so it's part of my work. And just, I had the opportunity to actually look at the law, which I don't think I've ever seen.
So it sounds like you found being able to review the law together as a useful experience to have more knowledge.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm glad.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have some positive feedback from Marcella on the group chat. I've been in many Zoom meetings and have not had any group breakouts. I enjoyed that. And I see Tasha has her hand raised, so I'll unmute you if you could share your thoughts.
Yes, I was just going to agree. I thought that the breakout groups was a lot easier than what I thought. But I also like the fact that we were able to discuss this law, because I feel like it's really important to be educated on the law so we can educate our providers.
Absolutely. And I'm hoping that one of the things I love about Equality's California's fact sheets is that they're so concise and straight to the point. And so I'm hoping that that tool is really helpful for you to be able to share with other folks and continue having those types of discussions with maybe your colleagues or maybe even some of the caregivers you might work with or other folks in the community. Thank you for sharing. So for the sake of time, we do have to move forward, but we would like to take one more person if we have someone who's pressing and like to share.
I see Anna Perez. I'll unmute you.
Yeah, our group had a really good idea, and I don't know if anybody else has heard of this or they know if they're doing this. We had a question if they're recruiting homes specifically for LGBT youth, like foster homes.
So is that the question? Is that happening currently in our
Yeah,
county?
we don't, in our group, we didn't know. And in my position, I haven't heard that for Santa Clara counties, but maybe it's happening in our county, other counties, if they're recruiting foster homes who will be open to LGBT or questioning youth.
It's an excellent question. One of the things that the All Children for All Families initiative does with the HRC is actually inform or educate different agencies on best practices for recruiting LGBT homes. Unfortunately, though, I'm not knowledgeable enough about the different counties to know what types of recruitment's happening currently, but I do know that is something that we should be doing. And if you'd like to learn more about what HRC does to help prepare agencies for doing that, you can actually find more information about the All Children, All Families initiative on the HRC Foundation website. And so I'm going to show you really quickly where you can find that information. So if you go to my website, Insight Consulting, there's a resources tab right here. So if you click on that, SOGIE resources, we actually have a link to the All Children's All Family website right here. So there's a bunch of other resources, including different types of books and publications that have been used to develop the trainings that I've done on SOGIE. Also the All County letters that are relevant, and some downloadable resources. But the one that I wanted to focus on right now is the HRC Foundation website. So right here, Human Rights Campaign Foundation is the All Children, All Families link. So please, if you get a chance, peruse the different options. Yeah. If you get a chance, I would definitely speak to your county reps who do a lot of the RFA approvals to actually find out if they're doing any targeted outreach for LGBT families. So the link is called dinsightconsulting.com. And I'll also make sure that it's in the website, or sorry, in the PowerPoint that we send to everyone after the training is over.
Darryn, we have one more question. Do you have time or should we move on and I can capture it elsewhere?
Sure.
All right, Kelly.
This actually isn't a question. And I know that this is not a Santa Clara County training, so like I'll be super quick. I'm from Santa Clara County. The recruiters do try specifically to recruit families that are supportive of LGBTQ youth, but they do it at LGBTQ specific events like Pride and stuff. And that's sort of the extent of the effort, but all foster parents are supposed to, in all of California, not just our county, get training on caring for LGBTQ youth. And it is the expectation in Santa Clara County, and I think it should be in every county, that all foster homes are accepting and supportive, regardless of whatever beliefs they have outside of their care for the child. But it is the expectation in our county. And there is some effort towards trying to recruit LGBTQ affirming homes specifically.
Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I want to review right now quickly is just the overview of each of the laws so everyone's on the same page, specifically for those who may not have gotten a chance to go deeper in the work groups. So AB 458 was a law that was passed in 2003, and this is the Foster Care Non-Discrimination Act. What this law really did was make it very explicit and very clear that discrimination in the foster care system on the basis of actual or perceived race, ethnic group, ancestry, et cetera, including sexual orientation, gender identity, and HIV status, was officially like stated in law. And so this law was actually one of the very first of its kind, which really elevated California to be leaders with regards to how we're protecting our LGBT youth in systems, rather in the child welfare system. A thing that's really important to point out about this as well is that this actually doesn't just apply to the youth in care. This also applies to all of the adults involved in child welfare, including our caregivers and our workers. The next law is AB 1856, which was passed in 2012. This was the LGBT cultural competency law. And what this does essentially is brings the idea of cultural competency, or rather cultural humility, as a best practice for providing adequate care for LGBT youth. And so this requires training for caregivers. Unfortunately, it didn't come with money, and so it was difficult to implement. But this did set the expectation, which led a lot of different counties taking the initiative on their own to go ahead and provide more comprehensive LGBT training with the lens of cultural humility. One of the reasons why this was important is because even though this law in 2003 was passed, what we noticed is that there were still massive amounts of discrimination and harmful harm being caused to our LGBT youth who were in care. And so they realized that there was an importance for us to put some law into effect to require at least our caregivers to be more knowledgeable and capable of supporting our youth. A law that came out more recently in 2016 was the LGBT Disparities Act, AB 959. And what this did was highlight the need and set the expectation that we are now collecting data about sexual orientation and gender identity in our CWS CMS system. What we recognize is there was a gap in services and understanding of whether or not we were meeting the needs of young people and elderly folks who are LGBT. So I'm curious from you all who have different experiences with the system, why do you think that collecting this data is so important? So if we can have you please raise a hand if you'd like to respond to that question. What are some reasons why collecting this data about sexual orientation and gender identity is so important?
All right, we have Margie. I'll unmute you.
Thank you. It's the way to get services and funding. If you don't collect data, you don't know where the need is and where the services should be. Without the data, people just don't have a voice. So it's really important to collect data so we can provide services specific to communities' needs.
Absolutely. The data that we're collecting does drive a lot of the funding. It sets the funding priorities. Also, a lot of this information is used for like individual case planning to be able to like meet the actual needs of the specific youth. It also, having data like this adds to a deeper understanding of the need for and or rather the need for institutional practices that need to be improved. And so without having that knowledge of how many young folks we have in our system that are LGBT, what the different identities are and how their different needs are being met, we're not able to like be able to meet them effectively. And so collecting it helps us be able to do that better. Some of the guiding principles behind this law, AB 959, is that all children deserve safety and acceptance in their homes and communities. All children need support and nurturance, regardless of whatever sexual orientation or gender identity they might have. In order for those young people to thrive, they need caregivers that affirm and respect them and are competent enough to be able to help meet their needs and be aware of what biases that might be impacting their ability to do that. And so the more we track, the more we know whether or not we're actually doing that. But obviously, when it comes to having that conversation around like what is your sexual orientation and gender identity, there's a lot of challenges that might come up. Mm-hmm. And so these are some things that you might want to consider, like questions you might want to ask yourself. For the sake of time, we won't go into a discussion around it, but keep these in mind. When you're thinking about disclosure, what are some things that might come up for your clients or the caregivers? What about the service providers? And how might you address some of these concerns? Also, what could you do to impact the client's well-being while you're having this discussion around sexual orientation and gender identity? So this survey, I'm going to show a few statistics about the experiences of youth in care, which helps understand a little bit more about why having a trauma-informed system is so important. The Human Rights Campaign did a survey back in 2012, and it was a massive survey, unique of its kind, because it was administered online, and they reached out to young people ages 13 to 17, which are usually difficult folks to reach when it comes to collecting data. And they compared the non-LGBT youth with the LGBT youth. And so this statistic is it was a national survey. They did over 10,000 participants. And so this is what we found out. Number one, they asked the young people, what is one thing in your life that you would like to change right now? And while the heterosexual students said money and debt and finances, appearance and weight, and improving mental health, our LGBT youth actually said understanding and tolerance and how to deal with hate. Many of them had concerns around their family situation. And many of them were concerned about where they're going to live and with whom. Another question they asked these young people was, what is the most important problem facing you now? And while our heterosexual youth were focused on things like classes and career and finances, our young people were focusing on issues that said that their biggest problem was having families that don't accept them, experiencing bullying in their school, and also having this anxiety and fear about being out and open. So I'm curious, from what are you seeing? Like, what does this tell us about the state of our young people right now, or rather in 2012?
Darryn, there's a message on the group chat from Haley. I think it's how to actually have these delicate conversations about self-disclosure of SOGIE info is what my staff, for example, is really interested in learning more about.
Okay. So actually, there is a training. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time to really go into a lot of skill practice and deep diving around how to have those conversations with young folks in this workshop. But if you'd like to learn more about what some engagement strategies that have been effective, we do have a training that I've offered with Bay Area Academy. And so you just go ahead and contact one of our BAA staff, and we can see if we can set that up in your region. We will cover some of that stuff on a more larger scale point of view, but we'll see what we can provide for you all. I think so. One of the biggest takeaways that I'd like to remind everyone is that what's happening with our young people, our LGBT youth, is that when you think about the hierarchy of needs, like Maslow's is one of the ways you can conceptualize it. Our young people are so focused right now on the basic needs that it impacts their ability to be able to focus on their higher level stuff, higher level needs. And so many times when young people really should be focusing on, learning and being in a place where they can, start planning for their future, so many of them are still focused on getting their basic needs met. And so this may impact their development domains. This may affect, their ability to socialize and, develop healthy relationships with their peers, which many of them should be doing at this point in their lives. So I think it's time to move on. Oh, so would someone please volunteer to read off this quote? This is a quote from the Administration on Children and Youth and Families.
It is critical that a young person who identifies as LGBTQ have a caseworker who has the capacity, understanding, and willingness to support the child's social and emotional development while in foster care.
Absolutely. Thank you, sir. So it's pretty clear about the expectation here that we want to make sure that all of our staff they have the capacity and the understanding and willingness to support our young people, specifically when it comes to their emotional development and social development. And so in order to do that, we know that there has to be certain things to be put into place. We're going to skip this question so we can move into the principles of a trauma-informed system. We know we have tons of best practices. There's many, 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 best practices that have come up, and things that you've already either experienced or things that we can generate together. And we'll do an activity to do that a bit later. But we do know that it's very difficult to sustain best practices when you're in a system that doesn't really permit it, or rather it's structured in a way that undermines our ability to provide, good trauma-informed service. And so the East Bay Agency for Children's Trauma Transformed team has developed a framework for helping organizations understand what's happening with them and how how to move from being a trauma-inducing system to one that's more of a healing organization. And so I'm going to cover a couple slides that's going to focus on some of their some of their work and some of the foundational principles. So here you should see their initiative here, which was a collaboration. Actually, it was led with the Department of Public Health over in San Francisco City and County. And so they're really taking lead on implementing this trauma-informed systems work in that county. And the 6 principles that we'll be covering are understanding trauma and stress, safety and stability, cultural humility and equity, compassion and dependability, collaboration and empowerment, and resilience and recovery. This organization recognizes that trauma is really a #1 public health concern when it comes to the populations we serve. We know that many of them experience a lot of intense community trauma, but when you think about our LGBT youth in care, they also have an extra layer of vulnerability and trauma that's tied to their identities. Trauma and toxic stress actually has been clearly linked with a series of serious health problems and relationship difficulties that impact our whole well-being. So as a workforce, it's really important that we carry out our mission in a way that promotes and protects the wellness of, of everyone, not just our clients or the young people we serve or the families we serve, but also for each other, for ourselves. And so if we all understand trauma and what's happening with us, then the idea is that we'll be able to take extra steps, whether small or large, to work better together so that we're minimizing some of the trauma and not re-traumatizing folks. So this framework here shows what happens with, it helps people understand the different types of systems. So many of our systems who are trauma reactive experience moments of fragmentation. Oftentimes they're very reactive when things happen. There's not a lot of safety felt in the workforce or even with the clients. And a trauma-informed system is one that is aware of this, and not just aware of what's happening, but aware of or taking extra steps to kind of minimize that. And so oftentimes they develop policies to minimize or resist re-traumatizing folks. They take extra steps to kind of work to shift the culture so that people are more aware of the effects of trauma and stress. And also they change and implement new practices to improve it. But it's not enough to just be trauma-informed. Like our main goal, at least with the Trauma Transformed team, is to move from a place of being trauma-informed to being to being a healing organization. And one of those healing org is one that is integrated. Everyone works together as a team. It's more relationship-centered rather than action-centered. Oftentimes there's a lot more collaboration on all of the different levels, and they tend to be more equitable and inclusive in their decision-making. And so one of the ways that they've been able to help do that is by using this framework here, where they engage with leadership to be committed to the goal of moving from a trauma-inducing to a healing org. They implement training where they provide the basic understanding so everyone has the same knowledge in terms of understanding what's happening with trauma and stress. And they actually embed trainers. So they recruit and train staff that are inside the organization to be able to help train the entire workforce. And so one of the things that I do with Trauma Transformed is I'm one of their trainers that trains the other trainers and also help coach them through the certification process. So they are expanding their skills and their ability to train their workforce. The structure also involves identifying folks in the community who really want to take this the trauma-informed systems work to the next level. And so these folks are in different layers of the organization, and they're called champions and catalysts. And they really work together as a work group to review policies, to pitch new ideas for policies to help shift the organization internally into a more healing org. And so once those policies and practices are implemented and duplicated, they also go through an evaluation process to see where they're at and to continue moving forward. So this framework here shows how they guide their work. So those 6 principles that I mentioned before are kind of restructured here, where you can see that one of the big takeaways from the work is that the foundational information, like the 2 big things that are the core to the work, is first understanding stress and trauma, so everyone's aware of what's happening, and to attend to culture, humility, and equity. So it's to change the culture in the organization to recognize the importance of culture, humility, and the need for equity in order to produce healing organizations. So we're going to go into the other principles a bit more detail over the next few slides. So one of the ways that you can conceptualize how these 6 principles work together is a house. One good metaphor for a healing organization is the construction of this house, where we all know that, ACEs and trauma, the adverse childhood experiences and trauma, are what our people are experiencing, not just our clients, but also ourselves. Everyone, according to the statistics, at least everyone will experience at least one traumatic event. And considering what's happening with COVID-19, I think this counts as one of those adverse experiences that many of our young people are experiencing. What we do know is that resiliency can be born out of trauma. And that's the ability to bounce back when there's a moment of trauma or when chronic stress is overwhelming. So people can grow from this if we support them through that, if they have the support of a helping other. One of the strong core foundations of a healing organization is first having everyone understand what's happening with us. Knowledge is power. And culture, humility, and equity. So those are the 2 foundational pieces that construct the house. That's what the rest of this house is built on. The pillars of the house are the other 4 principles, which are safety and stability. So that's the act of creating a space where people feel safe so that they can function at a higher level, where they know what to expect and they can are reinforced. Systems and practices are reinforced. There's compassionate dependability, which is about the relational part of how we're able to better meet the needs of folks who are experiencing a traumatic moment or who are triggered. Collaboration empowerment is all about helping people move from a place of victimhood to a place of empowerment. So they're not someone who things are happening to or people doing things to them, but it's more that they have more agency, more control over what's happening and being able to take action. And the last pillar is resilience and healing, which is about fostering a community and a support that attends to fostering more resilience and repairing the damage that has been done to us when we're experiencing chronic stress and trauma. And so that creates our entire trauma-informed system. So without these 6 elements together, it's very difficult to maintain a trauma-informed system. And those practices, all of these best practices that we all are so knowledgeable about, the idea is that without this trauma-informed system, it's very difficult to keep those practices as a staple. So that's how that's a trauma transforms method of creating a healing org. And so can I have a volunteer go ahead and read out what this quote is? This is a quote that represents the idea of one of the core foundational principles, which is understanding stress and trauma. Do you have any volunteers? Go ahead and raise your hand.
Dan, we have just about a little more than 20 minutes left.
Okay. I think in this case, I'll go ahead and speed through then. So when it comes to understanding trauma and stress, learning about the psychobiology of stress, toxic stress, and trauma is liberating for people because it helps them understand what's happening with them. It gives them explanatory reasons for some of the puzzling behaviors that we might have when we're interacting with folks that might make us overwhelmed and dominate us. So trauma can be defined as an event or an experience, an event, an experience, and the effect of trauma. When the event happens, oftentimes people feel, they experience a moment of actual danger or a perceived threat of danger that's extreme. Once that happens, they experience this moment of fight, flight, or freeze where their body becomes overwhelmed and they often feel helpless to escape this situation. When that happens, your brain and your body actually becomes overwhelmed. And so you lose access to your ability to function highly. And it's like the idea of you're flipping your lid. And so you're more in your reactive brain, which means that it's very difficult to actually calm someone down intellectually when they're in their reactive brain. So this actually creates an effect of disintegration and dysregulation where they lose access to be able to regulate their internal states. And what happens is if this continues on for a period of time, or if it goes on without any support, it can have really lasting adverse effects on our bodies. So if we understand that, then we can start moving to the next principle, which is culture humility. And so this quote shows, sort of helps conceptualize the concept of culture humility and equity and its importance as one of those foundational principles. We know that we live in a society where there's a lot of oppression, systemic oppression, and equity is something that we're all working towards. But that takes us to come from a lens of cultural sensitivity to be able to meet people where they're at and to be empowered to actually have conversations that are crucial, challenging conversations sometimes around racial justice and equity. And it's important that when you're thinking about the intersectionality of our young people, many of them are not just foster youth, but they're also experiencing, systemic oppression because of our ethnicities, being LGBT. Like this world doesn't always have, this world has a tendency to marginalize our folks. And so racial equity and cultural sensitivity is really key in order to help really support them. One of the other principles around safety and stability is to be able to create, or rather, trauma unpredictably violates our physical, social, and emotional safety, which actually results in the sense of threat always being felt. And so there's a need, it creates a need in folks to manage those risks. And that's often when you'll see our young people be really trauma reactive or hypervigilant, where they get anxious and they're not able to really focus, is because they're spending their time assessing for threat. And so we have a need to create safety with our young people before we're able to really truly engage with them so that we can help them develop. When it comes to compassion and dependability, we know that trauma is very overwhelming and it can leave us feel isolated and betrayed, which can actually make it really difficult to trust others who are there to really offer support. And so whenever we experience a moment of compassion and dependability in our relationships with folks, it helps us reestablish trust. And for our LGBT youth in care, we know that many of them do come into care because of rejection from their families, or they're running away from the circumstance, the environment that they were in. And so it's really important that we attend to, at least respond to them with compassion and being a dependable person in their life so that way they can start the healing process. We mentioned before that collaboration empowerment was key when it comes to helping folks move from victim to survivor, or rather victim to change maker. And what that takes is for us to work together to create opportunities where people can recognize their voice and choice and take action. And so you can do that in large and small ways. Something as small as having a conversation by, let's say, for example, you're working with a young person and you're trying to, figure out, what school system, they might, or rather, actually, I can't think of any examples. Can someone think of an example or share an example where you would help a young person recognize their voice and choice in a very small way?
I mean, what comes to mind is like deciding how they want to go about their day and maybe deciding to opt out of something if they don't have the spoons for it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I keep thinking about, like, with our sexual and reproductive wellness trainings, we talk about that young people actually get a right to what doctor they have. And so one thing that a worker could do to help them recognize voice and choice in that regard is to just ask them, let them know, number one, you have a choice. And number two, ask them, so what kind of doctor would you prefer? Do you prefer male or female? Do you prefer someone who has the same ethnicity of you? And obviously there's restrictions on that specific choice. They can only choose within their insurance provider, but that's a small way. That's a small way that you can help them. And I'm sure you can think of other larger ways that you can do that as well. The last one is resilience and recovery, which is really key when it comes to helping support people through supporting people through working through a really traumatic time. We know that trauma can have a long-lasting impact and a broad impact on our lives over time, because the trauma tends to give us moments where we have triggers, where there's small little things that might, like a sense or a smell or maybe a word or even a similar context of a situation, which could trigger someone to fall right back into that fight, flight, or freeze response that was formed when they had their initial trauma experience. And so since we understand that, what we can do is help foster resilience in folks so that they can bounce back from those moments by helping them recognize those triggers and identify strengths that they can use to help mitigate those triggers. And so when we focus on our strengths and the clear steps on how we can move forward for wellness, we're more likely to be resilient and recover from those moments. And so for the next activity we're going to give you about 10 minutes to break into small groups and really put these principles into action. The goal for this activity is for you to discuss. We're going to break you up again in 6 groups. We're going to assign one of the principles to each group, which will correspond with your the number. So the first number will, breakout group number 1 will be overcoming or recognizing stress and trauma, and group number 2 will be cultural humility and equity, and so on and so forth. I'll go ahead and add the instructions in the chat to remind you. And the goal is for you to discuss and brainstorm what are some of the best practices that you're aware of, either you've put into practice or seen in practice, that could be used to really embody this principle. So I definitely encourage you to choose at least one person in the group to be a scribe. And there's this document here, which is showing up on my screen. This is the best practices brainstorm. So group 1, the scribe will write down whatever best practices the team has come up with in the individual section or organizational section. And so there's little questions here that can help prompt you. What insights did you gain from it? Were there any questions that came up? And what did you learn from the activity that might help you with your work? So can I get a couple responses to any of the questions that are listed here? And go ahead and raise your hand, and Bernadette will give you a call. Or sorry, not Bernadette. One of our staff will call on you. Do we have any volunteers?
I am not seeing any hands raised. Do we have any spokespeople from the groups?
think many folks might be.
I see a hand raised here. Avni, I will unmute you.
Thank you, Avni.
We had safety and stability. So a couple things, I won't go into all of them, but a couple things that we talked about is having open communication and engaging with the client on an ongoing basis, validating and listening to them, having a safety plan, building a relationship with the youth to reach out when they feel unsafe, modeling and creating safe space, having the hate-free zone sign, pronouns on our email signature, being aware of our bias on the organization side, having awareness and knowledge base in terms of our youth's culture, training and resources, encouraging and welcoming feedback, implementing the feedback, and then also having awareness of what our population is, and that can be done with data collection and access to data. So
it sounds like quite a list there. That's awesome. How did you enjoy the discussion with the team?
That's good. Yeah, we had quite a lot to talk about, so that was good.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for sharing. So I did want to give credit where credit's due. A lot of the information that was pulled together about the trauma-informed systems work was were elements of the curricula that was developed by UCSF Hearts and Joyce Dorado. And so if you want to learn more about Trauma Transformed and the work they do, their website is located right here in the PowerPoint. And also, if you have any other questions about the process of being a trainer, please go ahead and let me know. We don't have time, unfortunately, for me to share my digital story, but my story talks about talks about my experience with an amazing foster parent who really embodied a lot of the principles that we actually shared. And looking back on that relationship and how it impacted my growth and development, I figured it would be a good opportunity to show you all how a caregiver can really support a young person by using these principles. So if you wanted to view that video, you can on my website. It's at the very, very bottom. And then the last of the activity really focuses on the different approaches to youth engagement. And so I was going to do a bit of a lecture and then ask each of you which of the principles really was embodied by this best practice. And so what we'll do, since a lot of folks are not able to stick around with us, is make sure that everyone gets copies of the PowerPoint, so at least they have the access to these approaches. And for the next 5 minutes or so, we'll go ahead and move through it. So one of the key things that is important to consider when you're engaging with LGBT young people is this idea of allyship and advocacy. It's not enough to be just tolerant of our young people, but to really foster their wellness. It's about partnering with them and helping really step up whenever we see situations of discrimination or social isolation happening. And so that starts with first us gaining a bit of awareness about what's happening with our young people and empathy for the experience. So that way we can start using that as a motivation for us to gain more knowledge and education and continue professional development. With that, there's opportunities for skill development around engaging with folks and moving to a point of action. And so it's that whenever we see anything happening to our young people, we're stepping up. A lot of folks look at the LGBT community as if we're one community. In reality, we're we're actually a whole host of a bunch of different communities. And so why a lot of folks focus the conversation of allyship specifically between heterosexual folks to queer folks, it's more about recognizing that we are all potential allies for each other. And so that really requires all of us, even queer folks, to do the same. And just for clarity, I know that the word queer can be a really triggering word. People in my generation often use that term as a taken back term. Historically, queer has been used as a derogatory term to hurt LGBT folks. And many of us have reclaimed that term and use it to be an inclusive term as a way to describe the entire constellation of LGBT identities. So when I'm using that term, I'm using it as a descriptive term for the alphabet soup of LGBTQI2A, et cetera, et cetera. So empowerment, this is one of the key, that's tied to our key principle of not only about compassion and dependability, but also collaboration empowerment. This is how people recognize their agency, helping them gain education around their rights and how to advocate for themselves, how to help them build a deeper awareness about the community that exists for them, and helping them get connected to community. Because what we know with our teens is that this is a developmental period where your social relationships start to become way more important than your foundational familial ones. And so oftentimes that's a huge source of support for young people. And if they're in foster care, they often don't really get the same opportunities as other young people to connect. And so whenever we can, it's really important that we help facilitate and encourage them to connect with their peers. Not only for them to get support, but also for them to learn and develop and continue to explore their identities. You know, I had the wonderful opportunity when I was in care to be a part of CYC. You know, it was, we had a local chapter. There was a bunch of young people who came from a whole diaspora of different experiences. And so I learned so much, not only about other people and other foster youth experiences, but also about myself, you know. And I started to grow and transform exponentially in that experience. And so I recognize the importance of being a part of a community, especially one that's empowering. And so as often as we can connect folks with those types of communities, the better. And there's many, luckily, especially in the Bay Area. There's many agencies that do this type of connection with young people. Also, there's opportunities in schools. You know, many folks may know that there's a lot of GSAs that have been popping out in a lot of our middle schools and high schools. And those are called the Gay and Straight Alliances, like school clubs that really focus on connecting queer youth with other youth who are allies. We mentioned earlier about creating safe spaces. This was some of the things that was lifted up in the best practices. And just to help people understand deeper about what safe spaces are, this definition was pulled together, which is, this describes that a safe space is a place where anyone can relax, be fully self-expressed without fear of being made fun of, unwelcome, or unsafe. And this includes these different layers of identity, which is like biological sex, race and ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, anyone's cultural background, age, or even physical and mental disability. Another way of looking at it, according to Advocates for Youth, is a safe space is a place where the rules guard each person's self-respect, dignity, and strongly encourage everyone to respect others. And so this is more like a culture and a policy. And so there's many things that we can do when we're interacting with our young people to create this safe space for them. Safe space for them. One of the things I always actively encourage is to look at policies and write policies if they're missing, that makes it explicit that this is a safe space and how we're going to do that as a team. Because when new staff come in, it can be part of their onboarding process about learning at least how this organization might move forward with supporting young people. So some of the ways that you can individually create a safe space is by using gender neutral language, which we've modeled a lot today. Also to share LGBT resources in addition to all the other resources. And so for our foster youth, many of them, you know, might be familiar with the Youth Rights Pamphlet. And that's a pamphlet that really outlines the basic rights for foster youth that are written in the Child Welfare and Institution Code. So this is the pamphlet that you might be familiar with seeing. This was created by the Foster Care Ombudsman. Well, we also want to encourage, whenever you're having any rights conversation with youth, that you also include the pamphlet that we sent to you, which is the Queer Trans Youth Rights pamphlet. Essentially it's the same rights. The only thing is that this tool here describes it in a way that young people can understand how it actually applies to their day-to-day life. And so it has examples in here about, you have the right to not be physically harassed or threatened. And then it explains it in more of a deeper context. So I would provide that to all young people because we don't really know right off the bat how they might identify. remember we covered earlier that there's many reasons why they might not disclose. And so we really don't know a young person's sexual orientation or gender identity until they actually do tell us. So it's better to err on the side of caution and just give everyone access to everything. Plus, doing this helps create an atmosphere of inclusion. And so they're more likely to actually come out to you and say something to you to get support from you because they recognize you as a person who is a potential ally. There's many things you could do in your physical space to create a safe space. Like, for example, I don't know if you noticed behind me, there's the "This is a safe space" poster, explicitly, posted in a place where you can see it. I did that specifically for this training, but you could do that in your lobbies, in your cubicles. Once we're able to go back to some semblance of normality with engaging with folks in our offices, you can create a safe space in your office or your home. And if you're doing web calls with young people, you can do what I just did to at least let them know, like small little indicators that I'm a person you can talk to. Also, whenever possible, I would encourage you to actually engage in those courageous conversations. Having a conversation with a young person around sexual orientation might be anxiety provoking for you. It might add stress for you as well. But if you can, lean into that and really come from a point of curiosity. And that once the conversation gets started, it can open up in a lot of beautiful ways. The Hate-Free Zone poster that I shared with you all electronically is another tool you can use to create that.
Darryn, there's a question about where the pamphlet was available.
So the pamphlet was sent to you all by chat, which I can also send it along with the PowerPoint to the BAA staff, so that way they can send it all to you. So you'll have that as well. So the next part of the training really focuses on some of the statistics that are tied to what happens when a family is not accepting for young people. This is based on the research that was done by Caitlin Ryan. Essentially, I'm going to speed through it because it's not really, for time. But what we notice is that when families are rejecting and they're not accepting of them at all, there's a massive increase in clinical depression, illegal substance use, and STD diagnosis for our young people. And so what we notice is that they tend to have higher risk behaviors when they don't have a strong connection with or when they lose connection with their family of origin. And this is for general young people. And so that or rather, it's likely we can assume that at least when young people are experiencing rejection from their homes and end up in foster care, that they may have similar outcomes. This is another example of some stats that shows their perception of hope. When they ask young people who are LGBT who have non-accepting families, like whether or not they see a happy future, only 35% of them say yes, while those who have actually accepting families have 92%. So we can see that the importance of having that familial connection is really key to their perspective of what's possible in the future. This statistic here this is a visual representation of the amount of suicide attempts that we've been able to learn about through her research. When we have severely rejecting families, you can see that there's a massive amount of more attempts at suicide over the course of their lifetime. And so these stats really kind of highlight why it's so important to make sure that our young people get connected with familial bonds that are affirming of their identities, people who are accepting of who they are. This is some stats that are some tips on the differences between the risk factors, the things we need to avoid with our families, and the things that we can put into place as protective factors for our young people. And this can be applied to our caregivers as well as our birth homes for young people who are going back to, who are in family reunification. So some of the risk factors are if you see or if you hear that a young person is being pressured to be more or less masculine, that's a red flag. If you hear a young person share that that someone said that the God was going to punish them, or blaming them if they've been mistreated by people like their peers or being bullied, those are all red flags we want to definitely do some intervention around. And also, if anyone is trying to make a young person keep their identity a secret, this can have a really negative impact on their well-being. And so those are risk factors. But alternatively, there's protective factors that we can put into place in our families, or at least encourage to grow in our families. And those things can be like talking to the young person about SOGIE. Like if we have educate our caregivers on SOGIE, then that helps them be able to be prepared to have thoughtful conversations around it, where they can enhance their learning. One of the things that I highlight in my story about my foster mom is that she had no knowledge about LGBT young people when I first met her. Her main goal was to ensure that young Black men didn't end up in the juvenile justice system. She had no idea what to expect when I ended up in her home. I was a studious kid, and I was like really engaged with my community. But then when I was going through my coming out process, I suffered with a lot of internalized homophobia. And so I ended up receding into myself, and she didn't know what to think. She was thinking that I was on drugs, that I was, depressed about my family. In reality, I was dealing with a lot of internalized struggle. And so luckily, she stayed patient with me. And when I moved out of her home and ended up in a group home and grew up and matured a bit, I came back and started talking with her more, and she had nothing but questions. And so I was able to help share with her the things that I was learning about sexual orientation and gender identity. And that helped my foster brother, who also identified as queer, because she was now equipped to have those conversations. So I can't but imagine, how things might have been different for both me and my foster brother if she had received some sort of SOGIE training before I got into her home. Another thing is that when you can help our caregivers kind of wrap their mind around their own internalized biases and their own, hardcore beliefs by first coming from a point of the main reason why we're here. Oftentimes, what Caitlin and Ryan learned is that those families that are usually not accepting become super accepting after they go through this process of recognizing what their bottom line is, which is the success of our youth. It comes helping them express affection and come from a point of love, helps them move beyond those hard cast beliefs. Another thing you can do is advocate for the young people if they've been mistreated, so you can help address those issues right away, but also model how a good advocate would advocate for the young person that's in their care. And the last is to require family members and other family members to respect the child. If you set that expectation early and help the families do the same, then they can help be advocates for that child within their family system. And I'm going to wrap this all up, since I've definitely gone over than I expected, with a little heads up about faith-based providers. I've heard a lot of rhetoric about how it's difficult to find placements, and people feel that religious placements or people from faith-based organizations would be not great places to put LGBT youth. And though there's been significant evidence to show that there has been some really harmful things that have happened when young people get placed in faith-based homes, we do recognize that not all faith-based homes are the same. There's things that we can do to keep those potential placements. And so there's a document that was in your handouts that really kind of speaks to this. And so I'm going to pull it up really quickly so you can see it. This was pulled together. It's called Getting Down to Basics for Faith-Based Providers. I grew up Baptist Christian, and I was raised in the church, and faith was a huge part of my identity and my well-being. And so when I started struggling with internalized homophobia, I really thought I was going to hell. I thought, all sorts of really horrible things. But one of the beautiful things that helped me shift from that perspective was going online and learning about this idea of open and affirming churches. So there's many faith-based groups that don't preach intolerance. They actually preach not just tolerance, but acceptance and love. And so an open and affirming church or faith-based group is one that is open to all people, including LGBT folks. And they have a stance, like a policy internally that they're affirming of their identity. So it's not just about tolerance. It's about encouraging and helping develop a positive identity. And so if you can do a search online for open and affirming faith, you may be able to find things in your region that may be helpful for attending to a young person's spiritual well-being. These tips, this document here is a guide for providers that are working with LGBT youth And this can be a tool that you can use to have conversations with some of those faith-based groups. You can also talk to your team to plan around ways that you might help foster this kind of, or facilitate this kind of dialogue with folks that either may have had a complaint against them, or you have concerns that something might come up if an LGBT youth is in their home. The Youth Training Project has a very strict stance when it comes to this, and they say that a homophobic home is not good for any youth, whether they're LGBT or straight. And so we encourage everyone that we've trained over the years to help people move from a point of non-acceptance to acceptance. And with that, I think I'm going to stop talking. And I really just wanted to say that I definitely appreciate each and every one of you all for sticking around. And if you have any additional questions or comments, please go ahead and flood the question section, and I'll stick around so I can answer them. But after that, please go ahead and fill out our evals and give us some feedback on how we can continue to improve.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Darryn. We really appreciate the time and thought you put into this presentation, all the experience that you bring to this.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Right on, Darryn. Hey, I hope you don't mind. I'll give you a call later. I got questions to ask you. I'm trying to introduce this stuff to my son's school. And I just kind of want to pick your brain on setting up something, because if they buy into it, they're probably going to want somebody to do a training on it. And so I don't know if there's something you could do, or maybe you can give me some tools so that I could do a training on it. But, you know, so just want to let you know, pick your brain if that's okay.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And if you have any questions, you can contact my number there. You can send me an email. We can set up a time to chat more. And if you need access to any of those resources, my website is there as well.